Ben and Jerry's is known as a progressive ice cream company, but its core identity is now a legal war over its own activism. A significant part of the brand's operational control is dictated by an independent board of directors, not by its corporate owner, Unilever. The company was originally founded in 1978 by two friends, Ben Cohen and Jerry Greenfield. In a Vermont petrol station, Unilever, a global conglomerate, acquired the company for $326 million in 2000, scaling it into a $1.5 billion global brand. However, the terms of this acquisition are now the center of an explosive corporate conflict. As part of the 2000 sale, the founders created the independent board to permanently protect the brand's social mission. In 2021, that board's decision to cease sales in the occupied Palestinian territories triggered a crisis, leading to Ben & Jerry's suing its own parent company. As of November 2025, this internal war has escalated. Unilever has fired the brand's activist CEO, and co-founder Jerry Greenfield has resigned from the board in protest after 47 years. The idealistic rise. Our story begins, as all great legends do, with failure. By 1977, Ben Cohen and Jerry Greenfield were 26 years old, and by any conventional measure were going nowhere. They were not entrepreneurs. They were, in the parlance of the time, hippies, or perhaps more accurately, drifters. They were two young men brimming with the counterculture idealism of the 1960s, but utterly lost in the cynical post-Vietnam reality of the 1970s. They were, and this is the entire foundation of the company, an odd couple, a perfect, complementary set of personalities. They were intrinsically linked since their 7th grade gym class in 1963. They famously bonded over being the two slowest, least athletic runners in the entire class, finding solace in each other's lack of interest in the conventional competitive ladder climbing of American life. This friendship, a bond between two outsiders, was everything. Ben Cohen was the visionary, the artist, the soul. He was a restless, creative, and deeply eccentric man who had already dropped out of college, tried and failed as a potter, worked as a taxi driver, and even served as a nighttime security guard at a local racetrack. He was a man of huge, chaotic, and unfocused ideas, a personality that was completely incompatible with a standard 9-to-5 life. He was the fun, but he was also the chaos. Jerry Greenfield was his perfect foil. He was the pragmatist, the scientist, the steady hand. Jerry had actually managed to complete his university degree, but his lifelong dream of becoming a doctor had just died a quiet, definitive death. He had been rejected by every single medical school he applied to. He was working as a lab technician, swabbing test tubes. His future a blank wall. Jerry was the stability, the one who would patiently translate Ben's wild ideas into something resembling a plan. By 1977, they were living together in a small, cheap apartment in Saratoga Springs, New York, sharing a profound sense of disillusionment. They were smart, they were ambitious, but they were utterly lost. They knew only one thing. They wanted to do something together, and they wanted it to be fun. Their first idea was to start a bagel business. It was a romantic, community-focused dream. They had this vision of getting up before dawn, baking fresh, authentic New York bagels, and delivering them, along with lox, cream cheese, and the New York Times, to people's doorsteps every morning. It was a perfect, small, craft-based idea. It was them. That dream died the moment they researched the equipment, the industrial ovens, the specialized bagel kettles, the massive dough mixers. It was all astronomically expensive. Their small combined savings wouldn't even cover the down payment on a single oven. The barrier to entry was too high, the machinery too specialized. The dream was, in a word, too industrial. So they settled on their second choice, ice cream. It seemed simpler, happier, cheaper. Their entire formal education for this new, life-changing venture consisted of a single $5 correspondence course in ice cream making from Pennsylvania State University. It was quite literally a how-to pamphlet they completed via mail, learning about pasteurization and butterfat content. After they both passed, they looked at each other with a shared, naive optimism and declared themselves ready to be professionals. They scraped together $12,000. This was their entire net worth. $8,000 came from Ben's savings. The other $4,000 was a loan, a final bit of faith from their families. They decided to leave the cynicism of New York to find a place that matched their laid-back hippie values. They considered moving somewhere warm, like Florida or Arizona, but the competition seemed too high. They settled on Burlington, Vermont. It was a progressive liberal university town, full of students, artists, and like-minded thinkers. It was famously cold as hell, which made an ice cream shop a ridiculous, almost suicidal business proposition. But the vibe felt like home. In 1978, they found their headquarters. It was not a gleaming new storefront in a busy shopping center. It was a derelict, abandoned petrol station on the corner of St. Paul and College Streets. It was a concrete shell. The roof leaked. The walls were stained with oil. The garage bays were drafty. It was perfect. They spent the entire spring of 1978 not as executives, but as manual laborers. They were carpenters, plumbers, and painters. They repaired the leaky roof themselves. They scrubbed the grime off the walls and painted them in bright, cheerful, clashing colors. They installed their second-hand equipment. On May 5, 1978, with a small hand-painted sign, Ben & Jerry's Homemade officially opened its doors to the world. From the very first scoop, the business was not a business in any traditional sense. It was a logistical nightmare. It was a company built entirely on the founders' own quirky personalities and their stubborn, almost childish idealism. It was a company that, by all rights, should have failed in 6 months. The first and most defining problem was Ben. Ben famously suffers from anosmia, a near-total loss of smell. For a person in the food business, this should have been a career-ending disability. For Ben, it was a revelation. Because so much of what we perceive as flavor is actually scent, Ben experienced food in a different, more primal way. He relied almost entirely on what he called mouth feel. While other ice cream makers, like the sophisticated European-styled Haagen-Dazs, were focused on smooth, elegant, refined blends, Ben found them boring. He wanted texture. He wanted sensation. He wanted, in a word, chunks. This became the source of their first creative battles, Jerry. The scientist would work for weeks to perfect a delicate vanilla or a subtle strawberry. Then Ben, the artist, would taste it, shrug, and say it needed something. He would famously grab a whole bag of Oreo cookies, or a handful of Heath bars, or a fistful of chocolate-covered pretzels, smash them with a hammer, and dump them into a $50 batch of premium ice cream mix, completely ruining Jerry's careful creation. Jerry was horrified. This wasn't ice cream. It was a mess. But then they tasted it, and it was incredible. This single sensory deficiency, this inability to smell, became the company's greatest creative asset. It forced them to invent the entire multi-billion-dollar chunk-filled category. Jerry, the dedicated friend, became the master taster, the one who would refine the actual flavors, the balance of sweet and salt, while Ben acted as the wild textural artist, the chunk evangelist. Their arguments became their product. The second problem was their shared idealism. The smart, industrial, and profitable way to make ice cream in 1978 was with cheap, powdered milk, artificial flavorings, and chemical stabilizers. You bought your ingredients on the global commodity market, ensuring the lowest, most predictable price. You were a food scientist. Ben & Jerry refused. They were children of the 1960s counterculture. They believed in real food. They believed in community. They made a decision that was, from a business perspective, financial suicide. They insisted on using only fresh, expensive local Vermont milk and cream from the St. Albans Cooperative Creamery, a collective of their new neighbors, the local farmers. This single decision, this moral choice, set their path. It would haunt their balance sheets for the rest of their lives. It meant that while their competitors, like Haagen-Dazs, could source ingredients globally, lock in prices, and predict their costs down to the penny, Ben & Jerry's entire business model was essentially tied to the weather. Their entire balance sheet was a hostage to the Vermont climate. A bad winter, a drought in the summer, or a spike in local cattle feed prices, any of these could send their primary costs soaring, wiping out their profits overnight. They were, in business terms, inefficient, vulnerable, and completely irrational. They were paying a premium for every single drop of milk, a cost that made any potential accountant sweat, but was, to Ben & Jerry, a non-negotiable part of their identity. But the public didn't know or care about the operational costs. They just knew that the ice cream was revolutionary. It was rich, it was dense, it was unlike anything they had ever tasted. It was full of surprising, joyful, massive chunks. The lines at the small, brightly painted petrol station grew longer and longer. And to thank this new community that was keeping their ridiculous, inefficient dream afloat, they did something no serious business would ever do. On their first anniversary in 1979, they held the first ever Free Cone Day, giving away ice cream to everyone all day long. This wasn't a calculated marketing strategy. It wasn't a cynical ploy dreamt up in a boardroom to drive engagement. It was a genuine, heartfelt thank you. It was chaotic. They were exhausted. They served thousands of people, and they loved it. But it turned out to be the most brilliant and most profitable marketing of their lives. It created a fanatical cult-like loyalty. In an age where competitors were spending millions of dollars on sleek magazine and television ads to tell people their product was sophisticated, Ben & Jerry's had found a shortcut. They didn't need to buy advertising. Their customers were their advertising. This single event, this act of fun, defined their entire philosophy. They weren't just a company, they were a community. This philosophy was put to the test in the mid-1980s. The brand was a local phenomenon, and they had begun to sell pre-packaged pints to local restaurants and grocery stores. Now they were ready to expand, to push their product beyond the borders of Vermont. But as they tried to move into new cities, they ran into a brick wall, a wall named Pillsbury. The Pillsbury Company, the faceless corporate giant that owned their main rival, Haagen-Dazs, saw this small, quirky Vermont brand as a genuine threat. And in a move of classic corporate strong-arming, they decided to crush it before it could grow. Pillsbury began systematically pressuring food distributors, the powerful middlemen who control what gets onto supermarket shelves. The ultimatum was simple, brutal, and delivered in quiet backroom meetings. If you choose to stock Ben & Jerry's, you will no longer be allowed to sell Haagen-Dazs. It was corporate blackmail, and it was devastatingly effective. For distributors, it was an easy, cold financial choice. Haagen-Dazs was a proven global cash cow. Ben & Jerry's was a weird, high-risk, unproven startup run by two hippies. One by one, the distributors folded. They dropped Ben & Jerry's. The company was being suffocated. Jerry, the pragmatist, was terrified. He saw their dream, their petrol station, their entire community-built enterprise dying. He saw the bank loans, the payroll he had to meet. His instinct was to call the lawyers, to file a quiet, desperate antitrust lawsuit, to fight the system from within. It was the sensible thing to do. But Ben, the showman, the fighter, the soul of the company, had a different idea. He was angry. He was personally insulted. This wasn't just business, it was bullying. He didn't just want to win, he wanted to make a statement. He wanted to turn this corporate bullying into a public spectacle. They took their tiny marketing budget and instead of hiring lawyers, they launched a public awareness campaign. The slogan was brilliant, hilarious, and perfectly captured their personality. What's the doughboy afraid of? They plastered the slogan on buses. They printed T-shirts. They started a dough boycott hotline, urging customers to call Pillsbury and complain. Ben himself, in an act of pure street theater, flew to Pillsbury's headquarters in Minneapolis, and like a modern-day protester, picketed the building, handing out flyers to its own employees. It was performance art. It was marketing genius. They had turned a boring, complex legal dispute into a simple, powerful David versus Goliath story. The public, and more importantly, the press, loved it. Pillsbury, a massive, faceless corporation, was suddenly being portrayed as a bully, terrified of two hippies in Vermont. They were humiliated. Facing a public relations nightmare and the threat of a very public lawsuit, Pillsbury surrendered. They backed down. The victory was total, and it changed the company forever. It cemented their identity. Ben & Jerry's wasn't just about good ice cream. It was a movement. They were the good guys. They were the rebels. And their customers weren't just customers. They were fellow rebels. This victory became their core identity. This David versus Goliath narrative was intoxicating. As they grew into a multi-million-dollar corporation through the 1990s, they leaned into this. They weren't just a company that did good, they were a social experiment. In 1985, they formally created the Ben & Jerry's Foundation, pledging 1% of all revenue to charitable causes. They plastered their social missions on their pints. They created flavors like Peace Pops. They were perhaps the most authentic brand in the world, but their success had created a deep structural flaw. The soul and the business were now one and the same. Their insistence on craft ingredients and activism was what made them beloved, but it was also what made them absurdly expensive and inefficient to run. And then there was the new problem. In 1984, just before the Pillsbury War, they had needed to fund a new, larger factory. The petrol station was a joke. They were constantly sold out, unable to meet demand. They needed real money. But the idea of going to Wall Street, of begging for money from pinstriped bankers, felt like a betrayal. So they did it their own way. They launched a Vermont-only stock offering, selling shares directly to their own customers and neighbors. It was another brilliant community move, but the result was the same. They were now a publicly traded company. They had shareholders. They had a legal fiduciary duty to strangers. By the late 1990s, the fun was fading. The company was a corporation. Ben, who hated the spreadsheets and the meetings, had already tried to step down as CEO, launching a Yo, I'm Your CEO contest to find his replacement. It was a fun PR stunt, but it masked a deeper rot. The company's explosive growth had stalled. The market was saturated. The low-fat and frozen yogurt craze of the 90s, personified by brands like Snackwell's, was cutting into their full-fat indulgence. Their growth was flat. And their new Wall Street investors, the ones who had bought the stock from the original Vermonters, were getting impatient. They were trapped. They were trapped by their own authenticity. They were too successful to be a small local shop. but they were too authentic, too expensive, too political, too inefficient to be a real corporate giant. They were a prime target, and in 1999, the predators began to circle: Nestlé, Dreyer's, and the biggest of them all, the $260 billion Anglo-Dutch conglomerate, Unilever. They all saw a beloved, stagnant brand that was ripe for a takeover. The company Ben & Jerry had built to be fun was now the subject of a cold, brutal bidding war. The two hippies from gym class were about to come face to face with the very system they had spent their entire lives fighting against. And the fight for the company's soul was about to begin, the deal with the devil. The year 1999 was the beginning of the end. The idyllic, chaotic, community-focused dream that had been Ben & Jerry's for 21 years was about to face a force it could not defeat: reality. The problem, as analyzed, was structural. The company was trapped by its own success, its high-cost, inefficient, authentic model, using premium Vermont milk, paying farmers fairly, dedicating millions to activism, meant its profit margins were razor-thin compared to its industrial competitors. Yet as a publicly traded company, it had a legal fiduciary duty to maximize those very profits. By the late 1990s, with market growth stalled at a mere 3%, this internal contradiction had become unsustainable. The stock price was flat. The Wall Street investors, who had long since replaced the original Vermont neighbors as the dominant shareholders, were demanding a solution. They saw a brand with phenomenal global recognition but poor financial performance. In their eyes, Ben & Jerry's wasn't a social experiment. It was a mature asset, and the time had come to unlock its value. The siege began quietly. Throughout the late 1990s, the company had received polite, unsolicited inquiries. But in 1999, the inquiries became formal, aggressive, all-cash offers. The predators had smelled blood. The first was Dreyer's, a major ice cream competitor. Their offer was a mix of cash and stock, an attempt to merge the two premium brands. Ben & Jerry were repulsed. To them, Dreyer's was just another corporation. Then came Nestlé, the Swiss food titan. Nestlé was a global juggernaut, a company that, to activists like Ben & Jerry, represented the very worst of corporate globalization, particularly through its controversial marketing of infant formula in developing nations. The idea of being owned by Nestlé was to Ben a moral horror. And finally, the most serious and powerful suitor, Unilever, the $260 billion Anglo-Dutch conglomerate. Unilever was a sophisticated, patient, and overwhelmingly powerful entity. They owned Lipton, Dove, and Wall's ice cream. They had the cash, they had the global distribution, and they wanted the Ben & Jerry's brand. This external pressure ignited an agonizing internal war. The battle was no longer Ben & Jerry versus the man. It was Ben & Jerry versus their own board of directors. These were not faceless enemies. These were their friends. These were people they had recruited, people who supposedly shared their values. But these friends were now trapped by the dry legal phrase fiduciary duty. Their lawyers and Unilever's lawyers were telling them the same thing. You are legally obligated to entertain these offers. You must act in the best financial interest of the shareholders. Ben Cohen, the fiery, passionate, spiritual leader, refused to accept this. He saw this as a profound personal failure. He had built the company as a social experiment to prove that business could be a force for good, and now that very experiment was about to be swallowed whole by the system he had spent his life fighting. He didn't just see it as a sale, he called it a betrayal. He went to war not against the predators, but against his own board. He launched a frantic, desperate, last-ditch campaign to find a white knight investor. He reportedly reached out to other like-minded, socially conscious business leaders, like Paul Newman of Newman's Own, begging them to buy the company, to save it. He organized Save Ben & Jerry's rallies in Vermont, trying to appeal directly to the public, just as he had in the Doughboy fight. He was trying to rerun the 1980s playbook in a 1999 world. But this time, the enemy wasn't an external bully like Pillsbury. The enemy was his own stock price. The investors didn't want to be saved. They wanted to be paid. Jerry Greenfield, the quieter, more pragmatic founder, was just as heartbroken, but in a different way. He saw the legal trap they were in. He, the man who had once been the company's master taster, was now just a single vote on a board that was turning against him. He later described the period as the most painful of his life, a time of deep grieving. In the board meetings, which were reportedly tense and emotional, the two founders made their moral case. They argued that the social mission was the company's primary asset, and that selling to a conglomerate would destroy it, thus violating the true long-term duty to shareholders. The board's independent directors, led by their bankers and lawyers, countered with cold, hard logic the Unilever offer was all cash. It was a massive premium over the stock's stagnant trading price. To reject this offer would be a clear, unambiguous breach of their fiduciary duty, and it would immediately trigger a catastrophic shareholder lawsuit that the company would, in all likelihood, lose. The predators knew this. They knew the founders were fighting the board, and Unilever, the biggest and smartest of the group, used this internal chaos to its advantage. They didn't just make an offer. They made an offer that was impossible to refuse. They raised their bid to $43.60 per share, a price so high it was disconnected from the company's actual performance. It was a knockout blow. The siege ended in April 2000. The final board meeting was not a celebration. It was a funeral. The vote was cast, the motion passed. The company would be sold. The company Ben & Jerry had started in a petrol station. The child they had raised on ideals of peace and love was gone. They were, in an instant, fabulously, unimaginably wealthy. Their combined stake was worth tens of millions. And they were, by their own accounts, completely and utterly miserable. Ben was so devastated, so repulsed by the entire process, that he reportedly couldn't even bring himself to attend the final press conference announcing the sale. He had, in his own words, sold out. But in that final dark moment of defeat, as the lawyers were drafting the surrender, as the $326 million was being wired, Ben & Jerry made one last desperate bargain. It was a stroke of legal genius born from the depths of their failure. They knew they had lost the body of their company, but they wanted to save its soul. They told Unilever's executives in no uncertain terms what would happen if the deal was just a standard acquisition. They, as the founders, were the brand's biggest marketing asset. They were the two hippies on the carton. They could and they would go on a global anti-Unilever tour. They would rerun the Doughboy campaign, but this time, Unilever would be the target. They would poison the asset Unilever was buying. They would tell the world that the soul was dead. Unilever's acquisition team, led by a man named Richard Goldstein, was smart. They understood this threat. They weren't just buying a company, they were buying an authenticity asset. They needed the founders to be in the tent. So, a negotiation began. A negotiation not about money, that was settled, but about power. Ben & Jerry forced Unilever's lawyers to write a new, bizarre, and completely unprecedented legal document. It was a clause in the merger agreement unlike any other in corporate history. This agreement stated that while Unilever would own 100% of the financial assets, the factories, the trucks, the trademarks, the profits, it would not get full control of the social mission. The agreement legally mandated the creation of a new independent board of directors, separate from Unilever's own corporate structure. This new board would be comprised of 11 members. 5 would be appointed by Unilever. 5 would be the socially minded directors who had been on the original Ben & Jerry's board. The 11th member, the tiebreaker, would be jointly agreed upon. This soul of the company was given its own legal power. Its one and only job, enshrined in the contract, was to protect and defend the brand integrity and social mission of Ben & Jerry's. This included specifically the power to veto any changes to the product's ingredients, the power to continue the company's social activism, and the power to select the company's CEO. To the Unilever executives in London, a group of seasoned, pragmatic corporate lawyers, this must have seemed like a brilliant low-cost concession. They were paying $326 million for a global brand. What was the harm in letting the two founders keep their hippie clubhouse? It was a sentimental clause, a PR shield. It appeased the founders. It allowed them to go to the press and say, "The soul is safe," which is exactly what they did. It was, in Unilever's eyes, a small price to pay to ensure a smooth, profitable transition. Ben & Jerry, though defeated, felt they had won a small, crucial victory. They believed they had built a legal fortress, a dragon, to guard their child's soul. They had no idea they had just built a time bomb. The first few years, from 2000 to the late 2000s, were the honeymoon period. The arrangement worked perfectly. In fact, it was wildly profitable. This was the dual-engine model in action. Engine 1 was the Unilever global machine. It did what Ben & Jerry could never do. It scaled Unilever's massive, pre-existing global distribution network was a superhighway. Ben & Jerry's, which had struggled to get into supermarkets 2 states over, was suddenly, almost overnight, on freezer shelves in London, Paris, and Singapore. The quirky Vermont brand became a global phenomenon. Unilever's massive R&D budget was also plugged in. They didn't just export Cherry Garcia. They began glocalizing, developing new flavors for new markets, funding the expensive transition to more efficient modern production. They took the Kraft company and made it professional. Engine 2 was the soul, the independent board. And during this honeymoon, it did its job perfectly. It focused on safe, high-impact, and deeply marketable activism. The board's first major campaign was a push for fair trade ingredients. This was brilliant. It was a non-divisive, universally positive social mission. It allowed the brand to stamp Fair Trade Certified on its tubs, giving consumers a tangible, ethical reason to pay the premium price. And Unilever loved this. During the 2000s, Unilever itself was undergoing a massive corporate image change, launching its own sustainable living plan. They wanted to be seen as a global leader in corporate responsibility. The Ben & Jerry's Fair Trade campaign became a poster child for Unilever's entire corporate CSR strategy. This was the perfect marriage. The soul was generating the positive PR, and the body was collecting the profits. The two masters of the company, the corporation and the conscience, were walking hand in hand. The independent board, funded by Unilever's money, felt powerful. It felt effective. It was successfully pushing a multi-billion-dollar corporation to be better. But by the 2000s, the world was changing. The financial crisis of 2008 had left a deep scar of public anger. Social media was creating a new, polarized, and highly charged political climate. And the independent board, this soul Ben & Jerry had created, now full of confidence from its fair trade victories, began to look beyond safe causes. It began to develop a radical, uncompromising voice of its own. It began to look at its legal power not as a shield to protect the brand, but as a sword to attack the system. The honeymoon was over. The time bomb, after a decade of silence, was starting to tick. The time bomb ignites. The honeymoon period was over. The perfect, profitable marriage between the soul and the body that had defined the 2000s was about to be tested. As the world entered the 2000s, the political climate began to change. The polite, consensus-driven world of the 1990s and 2000s was giving way to something angrier, more polarized, and more online. And the independent board, the dragon Ben & Jerry had created to guard their child's soul, was beginning to wake up. For a decade, the board had been content it had successfully pushed Unilever, a $260 billion giant, to adopt fair trade sourcing across the entire Ben & Jerry's product line. This was a colossal victory. It proved their power. It was safe activism that was universally praised, and it was brilliant marketing. It gave Unilever a poster child for its new corporate sustainability plan. The dual-engine model was working. The soul and the body were, for a brief, shining moment, in perfect alignment. But this success bred confidence. The independent board, a collection of activists, academics, and social justice leaders, began to see their role not just as a shield to protect the brand, but as a sword to attack the system. They had Unilever's money, a global platform, and most importantly, a legally iron-clad contract that said Unilever could not stop them. The first tremor, the first sign of a crack in the marriage, came in 2011. The Occupy Wall Street movement had exploded, a raw, angry protest against the very financial inequality that a conglomerate like Unilever arguably represented. The independent board, true to its counterculture roots, decided to act. They released a formal statement of solidarity with the protesters. They even sent employees to hand out free ice cream to the demonstrators in Zuccotti Park. For Unilever's executives in London, this was awkward, deeply awkward. Their $1.5 billion brand was now on the 10 o'clock news, literally feeding the people who were calling for the dismantling of the global financial system that Unilever dominated. It was the first time the child had publicly embarrassed the parent, but it was a minor embarrassment. It was a single news cycle. The protest faded. Unilever smoothed things over. The incident was logged as a cost of doing business with an activist brand. The time bomb, having ticked once, went silent again. The real shift, the point of no return, began 5 years later. In 2016, as the Black Lives Matter movement grew from a hashtag into a national force, the independent board decided to take a side. This was a new threshold. Fair trade was about economics. It was about helping poor farmers in faraway countries. This was about race. It was about police. It was about the volatile, painful, and deeply divisive core of American political life. The board's 2016 statement, titled "Why Black Lives Matter," was a shock to the corporate world. It was not a vague, focus-grouped platitude about diversity or understanding. It was a direct, academic, and unblinking essay on systemic racism. It was, by corporate standards, radical. And then, in 2020, the world exploded. The murder of George Floyd lit a fire that consumed the globe. And the Ben & Jerry's independent board, which had already laid its philosophical groundwork, saw this not as a crisis to be managed, but as a moment to lead. While every other corporation in America was scrambling, releasing vague, panicked tweets about standing together or listening and learning, the Ben & Jerry's board did something unprecedented. They released a statement so blunt, so radical, it was like a grenade thrown into the boardroom. It was titled, "We Must Dismantle White Supremacy." It was not a statement. It was a set of non-negotiable demands. It was a radical four-point plan that called for a formal government commission to study the effects of slavery and for the dismantling of the systems and structures of white supremacy. This was not marketing. This was a direct political lobby. The brand had, in an instant, crossed a line. It was no longer an activist-themed company. It was a political entity that also happened to sell ice cream. The schism was immediate. For the first time in the company's history, a significant portion of its customers turned on it. The backlash was not just from the fringe, it was from the mainstream moderates, conservatives, police unions, and longtime customers who had been with them since the Doughboy days were, in a word, alienated. They flooded the brand's social media with angry comments. "I just want ice cream, not a lecture. I'm sick of being called a racist by a tub of frozen dessert." A wave of boycotts began, and this time it was measurable. The brand's Net Promoter Score, a key metric of customer loyalty, which had for decades been in the high 70s, a level of cult-like devotion, suddenly plummeted. Among conservative and moderate demographics, it went negative. This wasn't just a PR problem, it was a financial crisis. As the outline notes, this polarization was a direct contributor to a 10% drop in U.S. sales, a hole that represented approximately $150 million. For Ben & Jerry, the men who had started a fun company, this must have been a deeply strange and perhaps frightening moment. They were still on the independent board. They had, in theory, approved this. But was this their voice? Was this the fun rebellion of the Doughboy fight? Or had the soul they created, this legal entity of academics and activists, become something harder, more radical, and more alien than they had ever intended? The bi-weekly board meetings were no longer about peace pops. They were now essentially war room strategy sessions about systemic racism. But here is the twist. Unilever didn't panic. Because while the $150 million sales hole was terrifying, their internal data, the sophisticated global data that only a giant like Unilever could collect, was showing something fascinating. While one group of customers was leaving in anger, a new group, younger, more urban, more activist, the so-called Gen Z, was flooding in because of the controversy. This new audience didn't just like the ice cream, they believed in it. Buying Justice Remixed wasn't a dessert choice, it was a statement. It was a badge of their own identity. They were not just customers, they were disciples. And crucially for Unilever's balance sheet, this new demographic was intensely loyal and willing to pay a premium for authenticity. This data created a new, cold, and brilliant two-pronged business strategy for Unilever, a strategy to manage the soul it was legally stuck with. Prong 1, isolate the damage. Unilever's leadership recognized that this racial and political debate was primarily an American problem. The brand was becoming toxic in the U.S., but it was still just a quirky ice cream in its new high-growth markets. So Unilever's global machine went into overdrive. They accelerated their globalization strategy. They poured resources into Asia. But they weren't selling, "We must dismantle white supremacy in Tokyo or Seoul." That would be insane. Instead, their R&D teams, as noted in the outline, developed a range of sophisticated, beautiful, and completely apolitical local flavors. They launched high-end matcha and mochi innovations. This was a brilliant financial hedge. They were using the profits from a safe matcha pint in Japan to offset the losses from a political pint of Justice Remixed in America. They were quarantining the soul's damage to a single country. Prong 2, monetize the badge. Back in America, Unilever realized that if this new, younger audience wanted a badge of honor, Unilever would sell them one. This was the birth of the diversification strategy. It wasn't a separate idea. It was a direct consequence of the 2020 political pivot. Unilever's marketing team saw that the brand halo had changed. It was no longer just wholesome or fun. It was now cool. It was rebellious. It had edge. And edge could be sold for a much higher margin than ice cream. They began to collaborate with exclusive high-end fashion designers in New York and London. We are not talking about cheap screen-printed souvenirs. We are talking about partnerships with what are known as hype or streetwear brands, the kind of labels that sell $150 hoodies to kids who are willing to wait in line all night. They launched limited edition sneakers with Nike. They launched capsule collections with fashion brands that the 50-plus audience had never, ever heard of. For the brand's original older fans, this was baffling. Why was their ice cream company suddenly selling $120 shoes? But for Unilever, it was a brilliant financial move. They were leveraging the cultural credibility, which the board's activism had generated, to enter a completely new industry. This new lifestyle business was a perfect financial asset. It was a high-profit, low-risk revenue stream that was completely insulated from the price of milk, the cost of cream, or the public health debate on sugar. It was, as the outline notes, a $50 million a year business. This new model, though cynical, was working. The brand was now a complex global machine. It was making money by selling safe matcha to Japan, expensive hoodies to Gen Z, and radical politics to its American activist base. It seemed, for a brief, chaotic moment, that Unilever had successfully managed the dual engine of conscience and commerce. And then, in 2021, the independent board, emboldened by its central role in the 2020 protests, made a fatal miscalculation. They had taken on Pillsbury and won. They had taken on systemic racism and, in their view, won. They felt untouchable. They believed their moral compass was infallible. So in the summer of 2021, they decided to take on everything. They decided to insert their ice cream brand into the single most complex, divisive, and emotionally charged geopolitical conflict on Earth, the independent board, in a decision that would prove to be the beginning of the end, announced unilaterally that Ben & Jerry's would cease selling its products in the occupied Palestinian territories. This was not a Black Lives Matter protest. This was not Occupy Wall Street. This was a decision that involved international law, sovereign nations, and religious historical claims. This was, for a global corporation, a geopolitical disaster. The time bomb Ben & Jerry had built in 2000, the dragon they had created to protect their child's soul, had just picked a fight it could not win, and its fiery breath was about to burn the entire kingdom to the ground. The war for the soul. The decision was made. In the summer of 2021, the independent board, the soul Ben & Jerry had created, unilaterally announced that it would stop selling its ice cream in the occupied Palestinian territories. The time bomb that had been ticking quietly for 21 years had finally, spectacularly, exploded. What happened next was not a boycott in the way the company had experienced before. The 2020 Black Lives Matter protest had been a domestic, political, and cultural firestorm, but this was a geopolitical inferno. The independent board, in its moral certainty, had just inserted a $1.5 billion tub of ice cream into the single most complex, divisive, and emotionally charged conflict on Earth. The backlash was not just angry tweets. It was instantaneous, global, and total. And it came from all sides. Pro-Palestinian activists, who the board had perhaps sought to support, were not appeased. Many felt the move was a half measure, a cowardly corporate gesture that didn't go far enough. Why stop sales in the West Bank, they argued, but continue to do business with Israel at all? But the more devastating and more financially catastrophic backlash came from the other side. The Israeli government itself publicly denounced the company. Pro-Israel groups around the world, including many powerful Jewish organizations in the United States, condemned the move as a discriminatory, targeted attack. The ultimate painful irony of the entire situation was the accusation that was now leveled directly at the brand, anti-Semitism. This was a devastating, personal, and surreal blow. Ben & Jerry's, the company founded in a petrol station by two Jewish men from Brooklyn, Ben Cohen and Jerry Greenfield, was now being picketed, boycotted, and internationally condemned as an anti-Semitic organization. The dragon that Ben & Jerry had built to protect their child's soul was now being accused of betraying the very heritage of its own fathers. For Ben & Jerry, who were still on the independent board, this must have been a moment of profound, dizzying crisis. Their fun company was now at the center of a global debate about the most painful and complex aspect of their own cultural identity. But for the executives at Unilever in London, the problem was not one of philosophy. It was one of mathematics. The soul had just become a clear and present danger to the entire $260 billion body. The crisis unfolded on three fronts. First, there was the consumer collapse. The 2020 boycotts had been a 10% problem in the U.S. The 2021 boycotts were a global wildfire. As the outline notes, key regional markets in Europe and Asia saw an immediate 5 to 10% drop in sales. These were the very safe markets, like Japan, that Unilever had been using to offset the political damage in America. Now, the politics had followed them. The brand had become toxic, not just in red states in America, but in grocery stores from Paris to Sydney. Second, there was the competitive kill shot. While Ben & Jerry's was publicly imploding, its lifelong rival, Häagen-Dazs, did nothing. They simply remained silent. They didn't have to run a single new advertisement. They just had to continue being the premium, high-quality, non-political ice cream. For every supermarket chain that was now nervous about carrying a controversial brand, for every consumer who was exhausted by the politics, for every family that just wanted a simple tub of vanilla, Häagen-Dazs was the safe, easy, and delicious alternative. As the outline states, Häagen-Dazs was able to simply walk in and capture an estimated 5% of its rival's market share, a wound that would cost hundreds of millions of dollars to ever win back. But the third front was the most dangerous. This was the one that made the 2020 crisis look like a minor spat. This was the systemic, legal, and financial attack on Unilever itself. The independent board's decision had triggered a legal tripwire in the United States. Dozens of U.S. states, including massive, powerful states like New York, Illinois, and Texas, have anti-BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, laws on the books. These laws prohibit state governments from doing business with or investing in any company that participates in a boycott of Israel. And Ben & Jerry's, by pulling its product from the West Bank, had just been legally defined as a company boycotting Israel. The consequences were catastrophic. Suddenly, the problem wasn't about ice cream sales anymore. The problem was about Unilever's stock price, massive state pension funds, the New York State Common Retirement Fund, the Texas Teacher Retirement System, who were some of the largest institutional investors in the world, were now, by their own state laws, potentially required to divest their holdings in Unilever. We are not talking about a few $1 million. We are talking about hundreds of millions, potentially billions of dollars in Unilever stock being forcibly sold onto the open market. The soul of Ben & Jerry's was no longer just a PR problem. It was a direct existential financial threat to its $260 billion parent company, Unilever, was now being sued by its own investors. Its stock was being targeted by divestment laws. The time bomb from 2000 had finally definitively exploded the corporate body. Unilever had to act. This was no longer an awkward child. This was a child that was actively burning down the family home. The order came from the highest levels in London. This must be stopped. So began the war. For months in 2021 and 2022, Unilever's lawyers, a team far larger and more powerful than anything the independent board could muster, pored over the 2000 merger agreement. They were looking for the loophole. They were looking for the off switch on the time bomb. And in 2022, they believed they found it. It was a brilliant, cold, and calculated move of corporate chess. The agreement, they argued, gave the independent board control over the social mission. But it gave Unilever, as the owner, control over the financial operations, operational structure, and asset management. So Unilever made its counter move. They announced they were not forcing Ben & Jerry's to sell in the West Bank. They were not violating the board's soul. Instead, they were selling the entire Israeli branch of Ben & Jerry's to their local licensee, a man named Avi Zinger. This was the loophole. The brand in Israel would no longer be Ben & Jerry's. It would be Ben & Jerry's. Unilever, the parent, would wash its hands of the problem. And Avi Zinger, as the new independent owner, would be free to sell the ice cream wherever he wanted, including, of course, the West Bank. Unilever believed they had outsmarted the board. They had, in effect, surgically amputated the problematic arm of the company, leaving the soul with no limb to control. They had solved the legal crisis, stopped the divestment, and ended the war. They had underestimated the soul's fury. The independent board saw this not as a clever loophole, but as a declaration of war. They saw it as a cynical bad faith violation of the sacred 2000 agreement. To them, Unilever was laundering the brand's integrity, using a legal trick to do exactly what the board had forbidden. And so in the summer of 2022, the independent board, the soul, did the unthinkable. It went to federal court and filed a lawsuit against its own parent company, Unilever. The absurdity of the situation was staggering. It became a public, deeply embarrassing legal battle, a company at war with its own reflection. All the internal tension, all the awkwardness from the past 20 years was now spilling out for the Wall Street Journal to print. The child was now officially at war with its parent. Think of the human drama Ben & Jerry, the two anti-establishment hippies, the men who had fought against corporate bullies, were now part of a bitter, multi-million-dollar internal corporate lawsuit. The money Unilever gave Ben & Jerry's to fund its operations was now being used to pay lawyers to sue Unilever. It was a circular, self-destructive, and deeply tragic conflict. The lawsuit was a stalemate. It was a war of attrition. The board won a temporary injunction. Unilever countersued. It dragged on, costing millions. As the outline notes, the annual legal and compliance costs from this one decision spiraled to over $20 million per year. But this was a war the independent board was always destined to lose. Unilever was the parent. It had infinite money. It had infinite time. And crucially, it still owned the body. It signed the paychecks. By 2025, the legal stalemate had become a cold war. The two masters of the company were no longer speaking. The brand was paralyzed, caught between a parent company that was furious and a soul that was uncompromising. So in 2025, Unilever, having failed to win the hot war in court, decided to end the Cold War by a different method, an execution. Unilever's leadership in London, now under immense pressure from its own shareholders, had to regain control. They couldn't fire the independent board. That soul was legally protected by the 2000 agreement, but they could fire the people who worked for it. Unilever's leadership identified the CEO of Ben & Jerry's, a man named Dave Stever, as being too loyal to the social mission. Stever was a long-time 30-year veteran of the company. He was a true believer, and he was, in Unilever's eyes, a traitor. He was listening to the soul rather than the corporation that employed him. So, in a cold, brutal, and public act of retaliation, Unilever fired him. This was the final act. This was the checkmate. For Ben & Jerry, this was the end of the line. The legal fortress they had built to protect their child's soul had not only failed, it had become a monster that was now tearing the company apart from the inside. The company was spending millions fighting itself. It was being led by corporate executives appointed by Unilever, who were now firing employees loyal to the original mission. The child they had raised in that Vermont petrol station was gone. It was now just a logo, a legal shell, a battlefield. And in November 2025, Jerry Greenfield, the quiet, pragmatic scientist, the man who had stayed on that board for 47 years, through the sale, through the honeymoon, through the political battles, to be the guardian of the flame, officially surrendered. He announced he was resigning from the independent board. It was the quiet, tragic end of a 47-year-long idealistic dream. The founders had lost. The corporation, as it always does, had won. The lesson of the tragedy. Jerry Greenfield's resignation in November 2025 was not a news story. It was an epitaph. It was the quiet, heartbreaking, and inevitable end of the 47-year idealistic dream that had begun in a petrol station. The last founder, the final guardian of the original flame, had officially surrendered. He walked away from the independent board, the very fortress he and Ben had built to protect their child's soul, because he could no longer stand to be inside it. The war was over. The corporation had won. So what is the lesson we learn from this 47-year epic? What is the final hard-won truth from the story of Ben and Jerry? The conventional, easy answer is that this is just another sad story about selling out. A story of two hippies who, in the end, couldn't resist the lure of capitalism. A simple tale of two founders who cashed in their ideals for $326 million. But that isn't the real story, and it's not the real tragedy. The true tragedy of Ben & Jerry's is not that they sold out, it's that they tried not to. The fatal flaw, the original sin of this entire story, was that hopeful, naive, and brilliant legal time bomb they planted in the heart of the 2000 merger agreement, that independent board of directors. It was a desperate, idealistic, and deeply human attempt to do the impossible, to surgically separate a company's soul from its body. For 25 years, we watched a war between these two masters, both trapped in the same corporate shell. The body was Unilever, a cold, logical, $260 billion corporate machine, a body that is built for one purpose and one purpose only: to grow, to generate profit, to answer to shareholders. The soul was the independent board, a passionate, radical, and emotional entity, a soul that was built for one purpose and one purpose only: to pursue an abstract, uncompromising, and expensive ideal. For a time, the machine used the soul as a brilliant marketing tool. The soul's safe activism, like the Fair Trade campaign, was the perfect brand halo. It made the body look and feel good. It allowed the body to sell more. to charge a premium price, to win praise from the same public it was profiting from. But when the soul became too loud, too radical, too expensive, when it stopped being a marketing asset and became a geopolitical liability that threatened the body's very existence, the machine, as it always must, moved to crush it. The 2021 Palestine decision was the moment the soul crossed the line. It was the moment the dragon Ben & Jerry had created to guard the treasury suddenly turned and set fire to the kingdom. What Ben & Jerry and the world learned in the most painful way possible is that a soul cannot be a clause in a contract. A soul cannot be a legal entity, or a committee, or a board of directors. A soul isn't a social mission that you can protect with a lawsuit. A company's soul is simply the people who run it. The moment Cohen and Jerry Greenfield, the two slowest runners in gym class, signed that $326 million paper in 2000, the soul was gone. They had given up control. They had handed the keys to the body, and in that instant, the war was already lost. The chaos that raged for the next 25 years, the infighting, the lawsuits, the political drama, it was all just a ghost. It was an echo of a battle that had been decided in a boardroom 2 decades earlier. So, what remains today in the aftermath of Jerry's resignation? What is the legacy? First, the body has one Unilever is in total control. The Ben & Jerry's brand is now a $1.5 billion a year global machine, a machine that is, ironically, more profitable than ever. It is a perfect, optimized, and ruthlessly efficient piece of corporate property. It has successfully quarantined the political damage. It now operates as a cynical but brilliant 2-track system. In the United States, its marketing still leverages the rebellious ghost of the independent board, allowing it to sell $150 hypebeast hoodies to young, activist-minded consumers in New York. Simultaneously, in its high-growth Asian markets, it presents as a completely different apolitical brand, selling safe, localized flavors like matcha and mochi to consumers in Tokyo who have no idea and no interest in the brand's radical American politics. Unilever, the parent, has successfully managed the soul it tamed the dragon. And when the dragon refused to be tamed, it was simply locked in a legal cage, while the corporation went about the business of selling its likeness. Second, the soul itself. What remains of the independent board? It still exists. The contract from 2000 is, as of today, still legally binding, but it is now a ghost in the machine. It is a king without a kingdom, a legal entity trapped in a contract, forever at war with its own body, a war it can no longer win. After Unilever fired the CEO, Dave Stever, and installed its own loyal corporate-minded leadership, the board lost its last real connection to the company's body. It is now a zombie board. It can still meet, it can still issue statements, it can still protest, but it has no one left on the inside to carry out its will. It is perhaps the most tragic, ironic fate of all Ben Cohen's fear in 2000 was that the soul would be killed. The reality is far worse. The soul has been preserved. Like a museum piece, it's been kept alive, but rendered utterly powerless. A soul in a jar, forced to watch as its body walks the earth, completely indifferent to its commands, and finally, the Father's. What remains for Ben & Jerry? This is the human heart of the tragedy. They are fabulously wealthy. They are, by any measure, 2 of the most successful entrepreneurs of their generation. And they are, in the end, 2 of the saddest. They are the ultimate outsiders, once again, just as they were in gym class. But this time, they are on the outside, looking in at their own creation. Think of the painful irony. The legal tool they created to protect their child, the independent board, became the very weapon that was used to destroy it. It was the board's own radical, uncompromising, and ultimately self-destructive escalation from safe fair trade to a suicidal geopolitical war that gave Unilever the moral and financial justification to finally step in and seize control. Their dragon didn't just fail to protect the child, it was the dragon that in its blind fury set the child's house on fire. The ultimate lesson of Ben & Jerry's is not that idealism is bad. It's that idealism, when welded to the body of a $260 billion corporation, becomes something else entirely. It becomes a product, and when that product, the activism, stopped being profitable, the machine, as it always must, found a way to change the product. What remains in the end is a tub of ice cream. On the lid, you still see the happy cartoon cow. You see the blue skies, the green pasture. You see the names of the two friends, Ben and Jerry. It is an image of fun, of community, of soul. But underneath that lid, the product is now a paradox. It is a container of contradictions, a rebellious product owned by a $260 billion corporation, a socialist treat that creates capitalist profit, a brand that preaches dismantling white supremacy while simultaneously and successfully expanding into new apolitical markets. The brand Ben & Jerry built to be fun is now perhaps the most cynical and most brilliant piece of marketing in the world. And that dissonance, that gap between the happy cow on the outside and the cold corporate reality on the inside, is the final tragic legacy of the two slowest runners from gym class.